There's a document that looks completely normal. It has a name, a last name, a date of birth, a father's name, a mother's name. It's signed, stamped, filed away. Everything in order. But every single piece of information on that document is false. The date, the parents, the name. An entire life built on a piece of paper that lies from the very first line. That's what part of the repressive apparatus of Argentina's last dictatorship did. Not just disappear people, but manufacture origins. To create, over the body of a woman who was going to die, a new story for the child she was about to bring into the world. A form of violence that didn't need to stay active to keep doing damage. Time alone was enough. The Southern Cone lived through the 60s, 70s, and 80s under a wave of dictatorships that shared methods and, in several cases, direct coordination. Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina all built systems of political repression that included kidnapping, torture, and the systematic disappearance of anyone considered an enemy of the order the military claimed to be defending. Operation Condor wove much of that repression into a network that crossed borders to hunt down militants, union organizers, and students. It wasn't improvised, it was a shared architecture of terror. In Argentina, the coup of March 24, 1976, installed a military junta that ruled until 1983. What that regime built wasn't simply an authoritarian government. It was a precisely engineered system of terror. Secret detention centers were scattered across the country, some inside known military facilities, others in ordinary buildings that gave nothing away from the outside. Inside those places, kidnapped people were interrogated under torture and, in most cases, killed. It's estimated that over those 7 years, around 30,000 people were disappeared. Their bodies, in many cases, were never found. Among the detained were pregnant women. Some had been kidnapped while already pregnant. Others became pregnant during captivity. The dictatorship made a decision about them that reveals just how far the logic of the system extended. Keep them alive until they gave birth. Not out of compassion, but to take the baby. The births happened in military hospitals or inside the detention centers themselves, attended by doctors who were part of the operation and knew exactly what they were doing. In every case, the mother was disappeared shortly after giving birth, and the newborn entered a chain that already had a destination, to be handed over to another family. The babies reached those families through different channels. Some were adopted directly by military officers or police. Others passed through intermediaries, doctors, lawyers, judicial officials who arranged the handover with falsified paperwork. In some cases, families with no direct connection to the regime took in children without asking too many questions, sheltered by explanations they never wanted to examine too closely. Civil records were tampered with. Birth certificates were forged. The babies acquired new names, new parents, new histories. And on the other side, the biological families had no name, no document, no thread to follow. It's estimated that around 500 children were taken during the Argentine dictatorship. The number is approximate because the nature of the crime was precisely to leave no trace. There were no lists, no official records of what was happening. The system operated in bureaucratic darkness, sustained by the complicity of people who had legal authority to certify what was false. Stealing those children wasn't only a crime against families. It was a political decision with its own internal logic. The children of the disappeared carried, in the regime's view, an identity that needed to be erased. Raised without knowing who their parents were, without access to the memory of what had been done to their families, they would grow up disconnected from everything the regime wanted to eliminate. The plan wasn't just to silence one generation, It was to sever the bond between that generation and the next. The first women who went looking for their disappeared children didn't yet know what they were going to find. They gathered in the Plaza de Mayo, in a city where most people preferred to look away. They knocked on doors that no one opened, filed writs of habeas corpus that no one answered, asked questions at military barracks where no one admitted to knowing anything. Over time, some of those women began to see that there was another layer to the disappearance. They hadn't only lost their children, they had also lost the babies their daughters had been carrying when they were taken. Children who were growing up somewhere with different names and no idea who they really were. In 1977, a group of grandmothers began organizing separately. Their specific goal was to find those children. They didn't know how many there were. They had no names. What they had were approximate dates of pregnancy, accounts from survivors who sometimes remembered seeing a woman give birth before being transferred out of a detention center, scattered fragments of information that had to be pieced together without a complete map. The grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo built their search with a patience that had no alternative. They collected photographs, letters, and testimonies. They cross-referenced information with human rights organizations and international networks. They filed complaints before the United Nations at a time when the Argentine government was still denying that anyone had been disappeared. They traveled, published, pushed for years. Each case was a puzzle missing most of its pieces, and some leads went nowhere. The central problem was proof. A grandmother might be convinced that the young man living a few blocks away was her grandson, but the certainty that would hold up before a judge required something that biology hadn't yet fully developed as a legal tool. In the early 1980s, joint work between Argentine scientists and international collaborators made it possible to apply a genetic analysis method capable of establishing family relationships between grandparents and grandchildren, even when the parents had been disappeared. In 1987, Argentina created the National Genetic Data Bank, an institution designed to preserve blood samples from relatives of the disappeared and compare them with anyone who wanted to know whether they had a biological connection to a family that was still searching. It was a scientific answer to a crime that had tried to erase biology with paper. When democracy was restored in 1983, a long and heavily resisted process began. There were amnesty laws, military pressure, cases that closed before reaching any conclusion, but the work didn't stop. The trials that gained momentum through the 1990s and moved forward with more force in the 2000s allowed investigators to reconstruct in detail how the system of child theft had operated. Survivor testimonies, leaked documents, statements from people who had participated and eventually spoke out, all of it built a map of what had happened inside each detention center, each hospital, each falsified civil registry. The grandmothers have now identified more than 130 restored grandchildren. Each restitution is its own story. Some people received the news with relief, having grown up with a discomfort they couldn't name, a feeling that something in their story never quite added up. Others received it with confusion, with anger, with grief. They had loved the parents who raised them and had to learn to hold two histories at once without letting one erase the other. Restoring an identity isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of a process that can take years and follows no predictable path. There were cases where the people who had appropriated the children faced criminal prosecution at the same time the restored person was working through the grief of learning that the person who raised them had been complicit in the crime that killed their biological parents. There's no script for that. There's no right way to process the discovery that your name was chosen so you would forget your own. In other parts of Latin America, repressive regimes also separated families. In El Salvador, during the Civil War, Children were handed over through networks that moved them out of the country. In Chile, there are documented cases of detained people's children placed in irregular adoptions. Each situation has its own particular history, and they shouldn't be treated as identical. But they share an underlying logic, using the separation of families as a tool of political control, a form of harm that extends far beyond the moment it is first inflicted. The search in Argentina continues. Most of the appropriated grandchildren are believed to still not know who they are. They live with a name that isn't theirs, with a history someone else constructed for them, unaware that families have been looking for them for decades. The National Genetic Data Bank remains open. The cause has passed to the restored grandchildren themselves, who have organized to search for those still missing. The theft of those children was a form of violence with an unusual quality. It didn't need to remain active to keep causing damage. When the secret detention centers closed and the military returned to the barracks, the crime kept running in silence. In every birthday, celebrated under the wrong name. In every document that said one thing and hid another. In every family story that carried a gap nobody mentioned. Some searches don't try to return to a past that no longer exists. They try, simply, to give a person back the ability to say their own name and know that it is true.